We're about to explore one of the most complex and honestly, most dangerous rivalries on the entire planet. We're talking about two ancient civilizations, now two modern nuclear powers. They share one of the most rugged, unforgiving borders on Earth, and their conflict, well, it seems to be locked in this permanent state of tension.
To really get your head around this relationship, you have to start with a paradox. Here it is. India and China, they don't fight full-scale wars.
And it's not because the reasons aren't there or the anger isn't real.
It's because the consequences of an all-out war between two nuclear-armed giants, home to literally a third of all humanity,
Well, they're just unthinkable.
And that's the puzzle, isn't it? Despite these catastrophic stakes, they are locked in a perpetual state of competition, a constant grinding confrontation. So the real question is, how on earth does that actually work?
To understand it, we need to look at this thing through 6 different lenses. We're going to start on the ground, with the high-altitude standoff. Then we'll rewind to explore a deep history of mistrust. We'll look at the concrete battlefield and see how trade itself becomes a weapon. Then we'll shift to the ocean chessboard, before zooming all the way out to the global balancing act.
Okay, so our story has to begin with the most visible, most raw symbol of this conflict, the physical border. And it's up here, in the thin air, that a tense standoff has led to one of the weirdest rules in all of modern warfare.
So back in the 1990s, both sides made an agreement to try and avoid a catastrophic escalation. The rule? No guns, no explosives. The result? Well, here we are, in the 21st century, and soldiers are literally fighting each other with sticks, clubs, and stones. And this isn't just a theory. In 2020, this medieval-style combat led to dozens of deaths, the first fatalities on this border in 45 years, a horribly dangerous new low.
But to really understand why soldiers are fighting with clubs in the Himalayas, you have to look back. You see, this tension, it wasn't always like this. It actually began, ironically enough, with a promise of friendship.
So, in the late 1940s, there was this pledge of peace. The huge territory of Tibet acted as a natural buffer between them. But in 1950, everything changed. China annexed Tibet, and suddenly they shared a direct border. Things got even worse in 1959, when India gave asylum to the Dalai Lama. It all came to a head in the 1962 war. It was a brief, but for India, a humiliating defeat, and it just shattered any goodwill, locking them in a cycle of mistrusts that pretty much defines them to this day.
You see, the fighting over this remote, barren land, it isn't really about the land itself. It's a physical symptom of something much, much deeper. At its very core, this is not a border conflict. It's a trust conflict.
And in the last few decades, that trust conflict has moved into a completely new arena. It's become a race to build, a literal concrete battlefield.
The scale of what's happening here is just staggering. China has paved over its side of the Himalayas with this vast network of roads. Officially, it's for economic development, but everyone knows it serves a dual purpose, being able to move troops to the frontier and fast.
And it's not just roads. China is also fortifying the border with people. They've built over 600 new villages in just 5 years. They actually pay citizens to move there, to become defenders of our nation's sacred land. It's a clear strategy to solidify their claims on the ground. Now, India is trying to match this pace, but frankly, it struggles to keep up with China's incredibly deep pockets.
Now, you might be thinking that all these economic ties would calm things down, right? The old theory was that countries that trade with each other, well, they don't go to war. But in this relationship, that idea gets completely turned on its head.
The reality is a massive, lopsided trade imbalance. India is deeply dependent on Chinese goods for everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals. By some estimates, about 80% of the trade is in China's favor. And this kind of asymmetry doesn't create peace, it creates a vulnerability.
There's actually a term for this: weaponized interdependence. It's basically when those economic connections become a tool, a weapon, you can use for coercion. I mean, when border tensions flared up in 2020, India banned Chinese apps like TikTok. In return, China can threaten to restrict critical exports, which is a pretty stark reminder of the leverage it holds.
So it's a very modern and very sobering update to an old rule. In this new era of competition, trade doesn't prevent war. It creates leverage. But this rivalry isn't just stuck up in the mountains. It's expanding. It's spilling out into a vast new arena, the Indian Ocean, which just so happens to be a critical artery for the entire global economy. What we're seeing is a strategic game of chess playing out on the water. China, needing to protect its trade routes, expands its naval presence. It funds what's called a string of pearls, a network of ports that makes India very nervous about being encircled. So, India responds. It upgrades its own bases near strategic choke points, and it deepens its alliances with the US, Japan, and Australia, creating what we now know as the Quad.
And that brings us to our final lens, the global stage. Because out here, this rivalry is constantly being shaped by the pushes and pulls of other major world powers.
India has long had a policy of non-alignment. Today, they prefer to call it multi-alignment, and a great way to see this in action is to just look at where it buys its weapons. Russia is still its single biggest supplier, but it's buying more and more from the US and from Europe. It's a masterclass in not putting all your eggs in one basket.
But this balancing act is incredibly precarious. It really exposes three core vulnerabilities. You've got an economic dependency on its main rival, China, a military reliance on an increasingly isolated Russia, and a growing strategic reliance on the United States, which is really the only power that can truly counter China's rise.
And that leads to the fundamental question at the heart of India's entire strategy. In a world of sharpening divides and competing giants, how long can you really keep balancing everyone?
Ultimately, what we are watching here isn't just a competition for territory or for regional influence. It is a competition for balance itself, a delicate, fragile balance, in a world where history teaches us time and again that no balance lasts forever.